I'm Marcus Thompson, 42, and I own 17 properties on Maple Street, including the house where my parents threw me out with nothing but a garbage bag of clothes. That cold February morning when I was 18, my father stood in the doorway and said I was dead weight who'd never amount to anything. My mother just watched from behind him, silent as always. They kept my college fund for my golden boy brother, changed the locks, and told the neighbors I was a disappointment who chose to leave. But they didn't know about the life insurance money from my grandmother, the one person who believed in me. They didn't know I'd been accepted to state on a partial scholarship. And they definitely didn't know that 10 years later, I'd return as their new landlord. The betrayal shaped me, but what I discovered about why they really kicked me out would shake this neighborhood to its core. The family photo still sits on my desk, though I tore off the corner where I used to stand. Derek's arm reaches into empty space now, the way it always should have been. In that picture, he's grinning with his football leather jacket, my parents beaming beside him like he'd just cured cancer instead of throwing a ball around a field. I was 14 when that photo was taken, already invisible in my own home, while Derek got new cleats every season and private tutoring to keep his grades barely above water. I wore secondhand everything and earned straight A's that nobody celebrated. My father would drive 2 hours to watch Derek warm the bench at away games, but he never once attended my academic awards ceremonies. The difference between us wasn't just favoritism, it was investment strategy. Derek was their golden ticket, the future NFL star who'd lift the Thompson name out of middle-class mediocrity. I was just the spare, the backup plan. Nobody wanted to fund that. My parents ran Thompson's Hardware, a store my grandfather built in the 50s. By the time I was in high school, big box stores were killing their business. I'd watch my father stay up late, hunched over ledgers, calculator clicking through the silence. My mother would bring him coffee and rub his shoulders, both of them, pretending everything was fine, but I knew better. I saw the overdue notices stuffed behind the register. I heard the whispered arguments about vendor payments and loan extensions. While they poured money into Derek's football camps and tournament fees, the store was bleeding out slowly. The cruel irony. I was the one who loved that store. I'd spent countless hours organizing inventory, helping customers, learning the business. From the ground up, I could tell you the profit margin on every item, the names of our best customers, which suppliers gave us the best deals. I had ideas for modernizing, for competing with the chains, for building an online presence. None of it mattered. Derek was the chosen one. Even as his grades slipped and his attitude grew more entitled, even as the college recruiters stopped calling and the scholarship offers dried up, my parents kept believing in the dream, kept spending money they didn't have, kept treating me like I was taking up space that belonged to their real son. The night before I turned 18, I heard them fighting in the kitchen. My father's voice was thick with frustration. "We can't keep carrying dead weight. The boy's got to learn to stand on his own. He's our son," my mother said, but her voice was weak, uncertain. "Derek's our son. Derek's our future. Marcus, my father's pause stretched long enough to break something inside me. Marcus is old enough to figure it out. I should have been hurt. I should have been angry. Instead, I felt something colder settle in my chest, a clarity I'd never experienced. Before, they'd made their choice long ago. Now I'd make mine. When morning came and they handed me that garbage bag, I wasn't surprised. When my father called me dead weight, I didn't flinch. When my mother couldn't meet my eyes, I understood. They thought they were discarding their failure. They had no idea they were setting their greatest success free. ***. Grandma Rose's letter arrived 3 days after I moved into my studio apartment above Chen's laundromat. The envelope was thick cream paper, my name written in her careful script, the kind of penmanship they don't teach anymore. Inside, her words would change everything. "My dearest Marcus," it began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone. And I suspect your parents have shown their true colors. I've watched them favor Derek your entire life, watched them overlook your brilliance while chasing fool's gold. They think they're practical people, but they're dreamers of the worst kind, the kind who sacrifice the real for the imaginary." My hand shook as I read on. 6 months earlier, when Grandma Rose died, I'd been devastated. She was the only family member who truly saw me, who celebrated my achievements, who made me feel like I mattered. Her funeral had been a blur of flowers and platitudes. My parents playing the grieving children while I stood in the back, forgotten even in grief. But Rose had planned for this moment with the precision of a chess grandmaster. "I've left you something, child. Not in my will. Your parents would have found a way to claim it or waste it on Derek's latest scheme. This is separate, protected, just for you. There's a life insurance policy with Mutual Trust. Policy number 47829RT, you're the sole beneficiary. The amount is $150,000. I had to read that number 3 times before it sank in. $150,000. More money than I'd ever imagined having. Enough to change my entire trajectory. The letter continued, "Your parents don't know about this policy. I opened it years ago, after Derek started getting into trouble, and I saw which way the wind was blowing in that house. They'll try to make a claim when they find out. Blood relatives always do, but the legal documents are ironclad. I made sure of that. She'd included copies of everything. The policy documents, beneficiary forms, even a letter from the insurance company confirming my status. Everything was legitimate, everything was mine, but the most important part came at the end. Don't tell them about this money. Marcus Thompson, let them think they've won. Let them believe they've successfully cut you loose. Use this gift to build something they could never give you: independence. Show them what real success looks like. Show them what they threw away. The next morning, I called Mutual Trust. The claims representative, Mrs. Patterson, had been expecting my call. Your grandmother spoke about you often, she said kindly. She was very proud of your academic achievements. She wanted to make sure you had the resources to continue your education. The process took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of paperwork and phone calls and certified mail. 2 weeks of working my dishwashing job at Romano's restaurant, carrying the secret like a hidden weapon. 2 weeks of my parents driving past my apartment building, sometimes slowing down as if they might stop, but never actually doing it. When the check finally arrived, I stared at it for an hour. Not because of the amount, though seeing $150,000 written in official bank fonts was surreal, but because of what it represented: freedom, opportunity, the chance to prove that their calculations had been catastrophically wrong. I thought about Grandma Rose, about how she'd sit with me at her kitchen table, helping with homework while the smell of her apple pie filled the house. She'd ask about my grades, my plans, my dreams. She'd listen like my words mattered, like my future was worth investing in. You're going to do great things, Marcus, she'd tell me. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. She'd been planning this for years, watching my parents make their choices, preparing her. Even in death, she was still protecting me, still believing in me when no one else would. I deposited the check that afternoon, then walked home through the neighborhood where I'd grown up, past Derek's old high school, where his jerseys still hung in the trophy case despite his mediocre career, past the hardware store, where I could see my father through the window, shoulders slumped over paperwork. They thought they'd gotten rid of their burden. They had no idea they'd just funded their greatest mistake. Asterisk, the acceptance letter to State University had been hidden in my dresser drawer for 3 months before they kicked me out. I'd been too afraid to show my parents, knowing they'd find some way to crush this dream too. The partial academic scholarship covered tuition, but I'd need money for everything else: books, housing, food, the 1,000 small expenses that separate college dreamers from college graduates. Now, with Grandma Rose's inheritance safely deposited, that letter felt like a passport to a different life. My studio apartment was 12 feet by 12 feet of possibility. The previous tenant had left behind a card table and a folding chair, which became my desk and office. The mattress on the floor served as bed, couch, and study space. The kitchenette consisted of a mini fridge, hot plate, and sink barely big enough to wash a dinner plate. It was perfect. For the first time in my life, every decision was mine. When to wake up, what to eat, how to spend my time. No one was there to tell me I was doing it wrong, or that Derek's way was better. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of potential. I registered for classes 3 days before the semester started. Business administration with a minor in real estate. My academic advisor, Dr. Martinez, looked over my high school transcripts with raised eyebrows. These are excellent grades. Marcus, why are you starting so late in the process? Family circumstances, I said, which was true enough. Well, you're exactly the kind of student we want here. Have you considered our honors program? I had considered it, dreamed about it, but never thought it was realistic. What would that involve? Additional coursework, independent research, projects, networking opportunities with local business leaders. It's demanding, but for someone with your academic background, I signed up on the spot. The first weeks were a blur of adjustment. My classmates seemed impossibly young and carefree, complaining about their parents' expectations, while I was grateful just to be there. They worried about which fraternity to join while I calculated whether I could afford both textbooks and groceries in the same week. I kept my job at Romano's, washing dishes from 6 to midnight 3 nights a week. The work was mindless but necessary even with my inheritance. I wanted to preserve that money for long-term investments. I'd learned from watching my parents that you can't spend your way to security. My other job was at the university library, shelving books and helping students navigate the research databases. The pay was minimal, but the real compensation was access. I read everything I could get my hands on: business journals, real estate, publications, economic forecasts, biographies of successful entrepreneurs. One night, while organizing the business periodicals, I found an article about a recent graduate who'd started buying distressed properties while still in college. He'd renovated them on weekends and rented them to other students, building a portfolio that funded his education and launched his career. I photocopied that article and pinned it above my desk. The hardest part wasn't the work or the studying, it was the loneliness. My high school friends had scattered 2 different colleges or stayed home to work in their families' businesses. I had no safety net, no backup plan, no parents to call when things got difficult. But I also had no one to disappoint, no one to question my choices, no one to tell me my dreams were too big or too small. The freedom was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. 3 months into my first semester, I ran into Mrs. Henderson from my old neighborhood at the grocery store. She looked at me with surprise, and something that might have been pity. "Marcus, how are you, honey? Your parents said you decided to strike out on your own." "I'm doing well, Mrs. Henderson. I'm at State now, studying business." Her eyes widened. "College, that's wonderful. Your parents must be so proud." I smiled and didn't correct her assumption that they knew. Let her think what she wanted to think. The truth was more complicated than neighborhood gossip could capture. That night, I called the hardware store. My father answered on the third ring. "Thompson's Hardware." "Dad, it's Marcus." Silence stretched between us like a chasm. "What do you want?" "I wanted to let you know I'm doing well. I'm in college now, at State University." Another pause. "How are you paying for that?" "Scholarship and work, I'm managing." "Good," he said, but his tone suggested he didn't believe it would last. "Derek's got a tryout with a semi-pro team next month. Coach thinks he's got real potential." Of course he did. Even now, even after everything, Derek's marginal achievements were more important than my actual success. "That's great, Dad. Tell him I said good luck." "I will. Take care of yourself, Marcus." The line went dead. I sat in my small apartment, looking at my homework spread across the card table, at the acceptance letter now framed above my desk, at the life I was building one careful decision at a time. They thought they'd taught me a lesson about some. They had no idea how good a student I'd turn out to be. Asterisk, asterisk. The business license for Thompson Property Services cost me $53 and represented the first company I'd ever owned. I was 19 years old, halfway through my sophomore year, and tired of watching other people build wealth while I just studied it. The idea came from necessity. My upstairs neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Kim, had been struggling to maintain her small garden behind the laundromat. Her arthritis made it difficult to kneel and weed, and she'd mentioned several times how she missed having beautiful flowers. I could help with that, I offered one evening as we collected our laundry from the machines downstairs. "Oh, honey, I couldn't afford to pay much," she said, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "What if we started small? Just weeding and basic maintenance, $20 a week." Her face lit up. "You would do that?" That Saturday, I spent 3 hours transforming her sad patch of earth into something that looked intentional. I pulled weeds, trimmed overgrown shrubs, and planted a few flats of marigolds I'd bought with my tip money from Romano's. When Mrs. Kim saw the results, she cried. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It reminds me of my mother's garden in Korea." Word spread quickly in our small neighborhood. Mrs. Kim told her friend Mrs. Patterson, who mentioned it to her neighbor Mr. Rodriguez, who asked if I could help with his overgrown backyard. Within a month, I had 8 regular clients and a waiting list. I reinvested every dollar back into the business. Better tools, a used push mower I bought from a pawn shop, work gloves that actually fit, a small trailer I could pull behind my beat-up Honda Civic. I designed simple business cards at the university print shop and left them at local coffee shops and community centers. The work was physical and demanding, but it was also deeply satisfying. There's something honest about making ugly things beautiful, about turning neglect into abundance. Each yard I transformed was proof that investment and effort could create value from nothing. My favorite client was Mr. Jameson, a retired teacher who lived in a small house near campus. His yard had been a disaster when I first saw it: knee-high weeds, broken fence, flower beds that looked like archaeological sites. But he had vision. "I want to attract birds," he told me during our first consultation. My wife loved birds before she passed, cardinals especially. We spent 6 weeks creating a bird sanctuary in his backyard. Native plants that would provide seeds and berries. A small water feature made from a repurposed fountain. Strategic placement of feeders and nesting boxes. The transformation was remarkable, but the real magic happened when the birds arrived. The first cardinal showed up on a Tuesday morning in March. Mr. Jameson called me at 7 a.m., his voice shaking with excitement. "Marcus, she's here. A female cardinal, just like Eleanor used to love." I drove over before my first class to see for myself. Mr. Jameson stood at his kitchen window, tears streaming down his face, watching a bright red bird explore the space we'd created together. "Thank you," he whispered. "You've given me my wife." That moment taught me something I couldn't learn in any business textbook. The real value of what I was doing wasn't just landscaping. I was helping people reconnect with beauty, with nature, with memories they thought they'd lost. I was solving problems that went deeper than overgrown grass. By the end of my sophomore year, Thompson Property Services was generating steady income. More importantly, it was teaching me skills I couldn't get in any classroom. Customer service, project management, budgeting, scheduling, problem solving under pressure. Every challenge was a lesson in disguise. I also discovered I had a talent for seeing potential where others saw problems. That overgrown lot behind the pizza place, perfect for a small community garden. The abandoned house on Elm Street with the beautiful bones. A renovation opportunity waiting for the right investor. the elderly clients who needed more than just lawn care, a market for comprehensive property maintenance services. One evening, while updating my business records at the card table that still served as my office, I calculated that I'd earned over $8,000 in my first year of operation. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was proof of concept. I was building something real, something sustainable, something that belonged entirely to me. I thought about my parents, struggling to keep their hardware store afloat while pouring money into Derek's increasingly unlikely football dreams. They'd taught me to be practical, but they'd never learned the difference between practical and strategic. They were trying to spend their way out of problems while I was learning to work my way into opportunities. The business license, hanging on my wall, represented more than just legal permission to operate. It was evidence that I could identify a need, develop a solution, and execute a plan. It was proof that their discarded son was building the foundation for something they'd never imagined possible. I just didn't know yet how big that foundation would need to be. ***, the private investigator's business. Card sat on my desk for 3 weeks before I worked up the courage to call. James Morrison, licensed private investigator, with an address downtown and rates that made my student budget wince. But the questions that kept me awake at night were worth more than money. I needed to understand why they'd really thrown me out. The deadweight explanation felt incomplete, too convenient. Families don't discard children over simple favoritism. There had to be something deeper, something they weren't telling me. Morrison's office was exactly what I'd expected. Frosted glass door, worn leather chairs, and the faint smell of cigarettes despite the no-smoking signs. Morrison himself was a surprise younger than I'd imagined. Probably mid-30s, with intelligent eyes and a firm handshake. "Tell me what you want to know," he said, pulling out a yellow legal pad. "My parents kicked me out on my 8th birthday. They said I was dead weight. But I think there's more to it. I want to understand their financial situation, their motivations. I want the truth." Morrison nodded. "Family investigations can get complicated. Are you prepared for answers you might not like?" "I've been preparing for that my whole life." 2 weeks later, Morrison called with preliminary findings. We met at a coffee shop near campus, away from curious ears. "Your parents are in serious financial trouble," he began, sliding a manila folder across the table. "The hardware store is bleeding money. They're behind on vendor payments, equipment loans, and they've mortgaged their house twice." I flipped through bank statements, loan documents, and credit reports. The numbers painted a picture of desperation I hadn't fully grasped. "But here's where it gets interesting," Morrison continued. 3 days before you turned 18, your brother Derek was arrested for possession with intent to distribute cocaine. The charges were dropped after your parents hired an expensive attorney and agreed to pay for a private rehabilitation program." My hand stopped turning pages. Derek was dealing drugs. Small time, but enough to face serious jail time. The legal fees alone were $15,000. The rehab program was another $20,000. Money they didn't have. The pieces started falling into place. They needed my college fund. More than that, they needed you gone so they could claim financial hardship for Derek's legal troubles. Having 2 dependents would have complicated their case for leniency. I stared at the documents, seeing my family's crisis through new eyes. My parents hadn't just chosen Derek over me, they'd sacrificed me to save him from the consequences of his own choices. "There's more," Morrison said gently. "Your grandmother's life insurance policy. Your parents tried to contest your beneficiary status, claiming you were no longer part of the family. The insurance company rejected their claim, but they hired a lawyer to pursue it." Heat flooded my chest. Even after cutting me loose, they'd tried to steal Grandma Rose's gift. "They dropped the case when their attorney told them it was hopeless," Morrison continued. "But they spent another $3,000 trying. The final piece of the puzzle was a credit report showing my father had applied for loans using my social security number, attempting to establish credit in my name. The applications had been rejected due to insufficient income history, but the intent was clear. They were willing to destroy your credit to solve their problems." Morrison said, "Identity theft is a federal crime." I sat in that coffee shop for an hour after Morrison left, processing the magnitude of their betrayal. It wasn't just about favoritism or poor judgment. They'd been willing to commit crimes to protect Derek, while throwing me away like garbage. But I also felt something unexpected: clarity. Understanding their motivations didn't excuse their actions, but it helped me see the fear that had driven them. They'd panicked, made terrible choices, and then doubled down to avoid admitting their mistakes. Derek wasn't the golden child I'd resented. He was a problem they couldn't solve, a money pit they couldn't acknowledge. They'd destroyed their relationship with one son to enable the addiction of another. That night, I called my parents' house. My mother answered, "Marcus, is everything okay? I know about Derek's arrest. I know about the legal fees and the rehab." Silence stretched between us. "I know you tried to steal Grandma Rose's insurance money. I know you applied for loans in my name." My mother's breathing became audible. "Marcus, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. You chose to save Derek by sacrificing me. You chose to enable his addiction by cutting off your other son. You chose crime over honesty. We were desperate, you were selfish. But here's what you didn't count on. I'm thriving without you. I'm building something real while you're still cleaning up Derek's messes. I hung up before she could respond. The investigation had cost me $800 I couldn't easily afford, but it was worth every penny. I finally understood that their rejection hadn't been about my worth, it had been about their failure. They'd thrown away their most valuable asset to protect their biggest liability. Now, I knew exactly what I was working toward, becoming so successful that their mistake would be undeniable, so powerful that their opinion would be irrelevant. The graduation ceremony was held on a perfect May morning, with families spread across the university quad, in folding chairs and proud smiles. I sat in the second row of business graduates, wearing a rented cap and gown that still smelled like the plastic bag it came in. The magna cum laude cord draped around my neck felt heavier than it should have, not from weight, but from significance. Dean Richardson called my name. Marcus Anthony Thompson, Bachelor of Science in Business Administration, magna cum laude, real estate concentration. As I walked across the stage, I spotted familiar faces in the crowd. Mrs. Kim from the laundromat, Mr. Jameson with his cardinal-attracting backyard, Dr. Martinez from the honors program, a small but meaningful cheering section for someone who'd started college with no family support. The diploma was real heavyweight, paper with raised lettering and the university seal embossed in gold. 4 years of 18 credit semesters, summer courses, and academic overload had led to this moment. My 3.8 GPA represented more than good grades. It was proof that their discarded son could achieve excellence without their help or belief. Professor Williams, my real estate law instructor, found me after the ceremony. Marcus, I've been meaning to talk to you about opportunities. Have you considered graduate school? I'm ready to start working, I said. I've got some financial goals I need to meet. What about working while you study? I know several firms that offer tuition assistance for promising students. Your academic record would make you very competitive. The idea intrigued me. More education meant more opportunity, but it also meant delaying the satisfaction of proving my parents wrong. Still, strategic thinking had gotten me this far. Tell me more about these firms. Within a week, I had interviews scheduled with 3 commercial real estate companies. My landscaping business had taught me customer service and project management, while my academic work had given me theoretical knowledge of markets, finance, and property law. The combination made me an unusual candidate. Practical experience paired with scholarly achievement, Harrison and Associates offered me a position as a junior analyst with full tuition support for an MBA program. The salary was modest but stable, and the learning opportunities were exactly what I needed. I accepted immediately. My first day at Harrison and Associates was like entering a different world. Glass offices, conference rooms with views of the city skyline, conversations about transactions happening over lunch. I was the youngest person in the building by at least 5 years, and my thrift store suits made me stand out for all the wrong reasons. But I learned quickly that competence mattered more than appearance. My first assignment was analyzing the potential purchase of a small shopping center in a declining neighborhood. Most of my colleagues saw only problems: vacancy rates, deferred maintenance, demographic shifts. I saw something different. The location was 3 blocks from a planned light rail extension. The surrounding area was showing early signs of gentrification: new coffee shops, young professionals buying fixer-uppers, community gardens, replacing vacant lots. With the right improvements and tenant mix, that shopping center could become an anchor for neighborhood transformation. My analysis was 23 pages of market research, demographic trends, and financial projections. I recommended purchase with a renovation plan focused on attracting local businesses and community-oriented tenants. Senior partner Robert Harrison called me into his office the next day. This is exceptional work. Marcus, how did you develop this level of insight? I grew up in neighborhoods like this. I understand how communities change and what people need. We purchased the property yesterday. I want you to manage the renovation project. At 22 years old, I was suddenly responsible for a $1.2 million investment. The responsibility was terrifying and exhilarating. Every decision mattered. Every dollar counted. Every choice would be measured against results. The project took 8 months and taught me more about real estate than any textbook ever could. I learned about contractor negotiations, permit processes, tenant relations, and the 1,000 small details that separate successful projects from expensive failures. Most importantly, I learned that I had an instinct for this work and ability to see potential where others saw problems. When the shopping center was fully leased at rents 30% higher than projected, Harrison called it one of the firm's most successful small acquisitions in years. My bonus was substantial enough to pay off my student loans and start building a real investment fund. But the greatest reward came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson, my old insurance agent, called to congratulate me. I saw the article in the Business Journal about your shopping center project, she said. Your grandmother would be so proud. I hadn't seen the article, but I found it that evening at the library. Young analyst transforms struggling shopping center. There is even a photo of me standing in front of the renovated building, looking more confident than I felt. I clipped the article and mailed it to my parents with no note attached. Let them see what their discarded son had accomplished. Let them wonder what else I might be capable of. That the diploma hanging in my apartment represented more than academic achievement. It was a foundation for everything that would come next. For years of proving I could succeed without their support, without their belief, without their love, I was just getting started. The promotion letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, sealed in Harrison & Associates official letterhead. Regional Manager, Commercial Acquisitions Division, with a salary that made me blink twice to ensure I was reading correctly. 5 years of 12-hour days, weekend site visits, and strategic thinking had culminated in this moment. Robert Harrison delivered the news personally, something he rarely did for internal promotions. You've earned this, Marcus. Your track record speaks for itself. 14 successful acquisitions, average returns of 23%, and the respect of every client you've worked with. At 27, I was the youngest regional manager in the company's history. The promotion came with a corner office to junior analysts reporting to me, and responsibility for commercial properties across 3 counties. More importantly, it came with access to deal flow that could accelerate my personal investment strategy. My first major assignment was evaluating a portfolio of distressed properties that a local bank needed to liquidate quickly. 18 buildings, scattered across suburban markets, most of them vacant or underperforming. The bank wanted to sell everything as a package deal to minimize transaction costs. I spent 3 weeks driving to every property, walking through empty office buildings and struggling strip malls, taking notes on everything from roof conditions to traffic patterns. Most of my colleagues saw the portfolio as a headache to many problems. Too much work, too risky for the potential returns. I saw opportunity disguised as complexity. My analysis broke the properties into 3 categories. Immediate flippers that could be renovated and sold quickly, long-term holds in appreciating markets, and teardowns where the land value exceeded the building value. Instead of buying the entire portfolio, I recommended cherry-picking the 12 best properties and letting competitors fight over the rest. Harrison approved my strategy, and we acquired our selected properties for 60 cents on the dollar. Over the next 18 months, my team transformed those buildings into profitable assets. We converted a vacant office building into artist studios, turned a failed restaurant into a medical clinic, and repositioned a struggling shopping center as a community hub for young families. The success brought recognition beyond Harrison & Associates. I was invited to speak at real estate conferences, quoted in industry publications, and recruited by larger firms offering bigger titles and higher salaries. But I stayed put, focused on learning everything I could about property acquisition and management. More importantly, I was building my own portfolio on the side. Every deal I managed for Harrison taught me something I could apply to my personal investments. I started small, a duplex here, a small commercial building there, but each acquisition was strategic. Each property carefully chosen for its potential, rather than its current performance. My approach was different from most investors my age. While they chased hot markets and speculative plays, I focused on fundamentals, good locations, solid cash flow, and the potential for value creation through improvement and better management. I bought properties that others overlooked, in neighborhoods that were just beginning to show signs of positive change. The key was patience and preparation. One spent months researching each potential acquisition, studying everything from crime statistics to school ratings to planned infrastructure improvements. I built relationships with contractors, property managers, and local officials who could help me execute my vision for each property. By my 5th anniversary at Harrison & Associates, I owned 7 rental properties and had a net worth approaching $500,000. Not bad for someone who'd started with nothing but a garbage bag of clothes and a grandmother's love. The Business Journal article about my promotion included a photo of me standing in front of the renovated shopping center that had launched my career. This time, I looked like I belonged, confident, professional, successful. I mailed that article to my parents too, still without comment. But the real validation came from an unexpected source. Dr. Martinez, my old academic advisor, called to congratulate me on the promotion. I always knew you had potential, Marcus, but this exceeds even my expectations. Have you considered teaching? We could use someone with your practical experience in our real estate program. Teaching appealed to me, the chance to help other young people navigate the challenges I'd faced. But I wasn't ready to step back from active investing. There were still goals to achieve, still success to build, still a point to prove. That evening, I stood in my new office, looking out at the city skyline and thinking about the journey that had brought me here. 5 years earlier, I'd been a college student with big dreams and uncertain prospects. Now I was responsible for millions of dollars in real estate transactions and building wealth at a pace that surprised even me. The promotion letter was framed on my wall, but it represented more than professional achievement. It was proof that merit could overcome circumstance, that hard work could triumph over favoritism, that the son they'd discarded was becoming exactly what they'd never imagined possible. I was still climbing, still building, still proving that their biggest mistake was throwing away their greatest asset. And I was just getting started on showing them exactly what that mistake would cost them. Asterisk, asterisk. The detailed map of Maple Street hung on my home office wall like a battle plan, which in many ways it was. 18 properties marked in different colors. Green for owned, yellow for available, red for strategic targets. After 10 years of building wealth and expertise, I was finally ready to return to the neighborhood that had shaped me. The economic downturn of 2008 had created opportunities everywhere, but especially in middle-class neighborhoods like the one where I'd grown up, property values had fallen 30 to 40% from their peaks. Foreclosures were common, and motivated sellers were abundant. For someone with capital and patience, it was a buyer's market unlike any I'd seen. I'd been monitoring Maple Street for 2 years, tracking every sale, every foreclosure notice, every sign of financial distress. The street I remembered as stable and prosperous was showing cracks. Elderly residents were downsizing or moving to assisted living. Young families were struggling with underwater mortgages. Several properties had been abandoned by owners who simply walked away. My strategy was methodical. Start with properties that wouldn't raise suspicion, build a presence gradually, and reveal my identity only when the timing was perfect. I established a limited liability company called Maple Holdings LLC, with an address at a mail forwarding service downtown. All purchases would be made through the LLC, keeping my name out of public records until I chose otherwise. The first target was 1247 Maple Street, a modest ranch house 3 doors down from my childhood home. Mrs. Kowalski had lived there for 40 years before her death the previous winter. Her children, scattered across different states, just wanted to sell quickly and split the proceeds. I offered asking price with a cash closing in 2 weeks. No inspections, no financing contingencies, no complications. The kind of offer that grieving families in distant cities couldn't refuse. Standing in that empty house for the first time as its owner felt surreal. The layout was identical to my parents' house, same floor plan, same vintage, same bones, waiting for the right vision. But where my childhood home had always felt tense and unwelcoming, this house felt full of possibilities. I spent 3 months renovating 1247 Maple Street, working evenings and weekends alongside contractors I'd used on other projects. New kitchen, updated bathrooms, fresh paint throughout, landscaping that showcased the mature oak trees. When finished, it was the most attractive house on the block. Rather than sell, I decided to rent 2 carefully selected tenants, a young teacher and her husband, both professionals who would maintain the property and contribute positively to the neighborhood's character. The rent covered my carrying costs with a modest profit, but the real value was establishing my presence on the street. Next came 1289 Maple Street, a larger colonial that had been in foreclosure for 8 months. The bank was motivated to sell, and I bought it for less than the cost of construction. This one needed more work: new roof, updated electrical, structural repairs, but the location was perfect. Directly across from my parents' house with clear sight lines to their front door. As I renovated each property, neighbors began to notice. The improvements were obvious and infectious. Other homeowners started upgrading their landscaping, painting their houses, taking pride in the neighborhood again. Property values began to stabilize and slowly increase. Mrs. Henderson, the neighbor, who'd run into me at the grocery store years earlier, knocked on my door while I was planting flowers at 1289. "Excuse me, are you the new owner?" "Yes, ma'am, just trying to bring this place back to life. It's wonderful what you're doing. The whole street looks better. Are you planning to live here, eventually?" "Yes. I grew up in this neighborhood and always loved it here." Her face brightened. "Really? What family?" "The Thompsons. From 1275? Recognition dawned slowly. Marcus Thompson." "Oh my goodness, you've grown up so much. Your parents said you moved away for college." "Something like that." I smiled. "It's good to be back." Word traveled quickly through the neighborhood network. The mysterious investor improving properties was actually little Marcus Thompson, the quiet boy who'd helped his neighbors with yard work. Some remembered me fondly, others seemed surprised I'd amounted to anything. But the most interesting reactions came from 3 houses down, where my parents still lived but rarely emerged. I'd catch glimpses of my father checking his mail, my mother tending her small garden. They had to know what was happening. Property improvements on their street were impossible to miss, but they showed no signs of recognizing their former son as the driving force behind the transformation. That anonymity was exactly what I wanted. Let them wonder who was investing in their neighborhood. Let them benefit from the increasing property values without knowing they owed it to the son they'd discarded. Let them live with the daily reminder that someone was succeeding right under their noses. By the end of that first year back on Maple Street, I owned 4 properties and had established myself as a positive force in the community. The investments were performing well financially, but the real satisfaction came from something deeper. I was writing a new story for the street where my old story had ended so badly. The map on my wall showed steady progress toward complete ownership. Not because I wanted to be a slumlord or exploit my neighbors, but because I wanted to control the narrative of this place that had shaped me. I wanted to prove that the discarded son could become the neighborhood's guardian and greatest asset. Of all, I wanted my parents to wake up one day and realize that their biggest mistake was living right across the street. Impossible to ignore, and too successful to dismiss. The plan was working perfectly. ***, the LLC and corporation documents for Maple Holdings were filed in Delaware, 3 states away from anyone who might connect the corporate entity to Marcus Thompson. The registered agent was a law firm I'd never met. The mailing address was a service that forwarded documents to my attorney's office. Every legal firewall was in place to ensure my acquisitions remained anonymous until I chose otherwise. Over the next 18 months, I purchased 7 more properties on Maple Street using this carefully constructed corporate veil. Each acquisition followed the same pattern: cash offers above asking price, quick closings, no complications that might draw attention to the buyer's identity. To the sellers and neighbors, Maple Holdings was simply a well-funded investment company. Improving the neighborhood. 1234 Maple Street came available when the original owners retired to Florida. It was the house where I'd delivered newspapers as a kid, where Mrs. Patterson used to give me lemonade on hot summer days. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now wealthy enough to buy the places where I'd once earned quarters for small chores. I renovated 1234 with particular care, restoring the wraparound porch to its original grandeur and landscaping the yard with native plants that would attract birds and butterflies. When I rented it to a young family with 2 small children, their laughter in the backyard brought life back to a house that had been silent too long. The transformation of Maple Street was becoming impossible to ignore. Property values had increased 15% in 2 years, faster than surrounding neighborhoods. The local newspaper ran an article about the Maple Street Renaissance, crediting an anonymous investor with revitalizing the area through strategic improvements and careful tenant selection. My parents had to be aware of what was happening. Their own property value was rising along with everyone else's, and the improvements were literally across the street from their front windows. But they seemed to exist in a bubble of willful ignorance, focusing on their own struggles while prosperity bloomed around them. Those struggles were becoming more visible. The hardware store that had been their life's work was finally closing after 6 decades in business. I'd driven past it the week before, seeing the store closing signs and windows that used to display seasonal tools and garden supplies. My father looked older, more defeated, loading inventory into a rented truck with help from Derek, who appeared to be living at home again. The private investigator's report had been prophetic. Derek's addiction issues had never fully resolved, just cycled through periods of apparent recovery followed by expensive relapses. Each crisis drained more money from my parents' dwindling resources, each promise of reform proving temporary. Meanwhile, I was quietly becoming the most significant property owner on their street. The pattern was clear to anyone who cared to look. Maple Holdings LLC owned the house 3 doors down, the Colonial across the street, the Cape Cod on the corner, the ranch house where the Hendersons used to live. 11 properties and counting, all improving under my management, all contributing to a neighborhood renaissance that my parents were witnessing but not understanding. The crowning acquisition came in month 20, 1298, Maple Street, the house directly next door to my childhood home. An elderly widower named Mr. Chen had been struggling to maintain the property since his wife's death. The house needed work, and he needed to move closer to his daughter in California. Standing in Mr. Chen's living room, negotiating the purchase of the house next to where I'd grown up, felt like closing a circle. Through the window, I could see into my parents' backyard, where my mother was hanging laundry on the same clothesline that had been there 20 years earlier. "You remind me of a boy who used to live next door," Mr. Chen said as we signed the papers. "Very polite. Always helped with groceries. Marcus, I think his name was. What happened to him? Family had some troubles. He went away to college and never came back. Shame, really. He was a good kid." I smiled and said nothing, letting him believe whatever story he'd been told. The renovation of 1298 was my most ambitious yet. I expanded the kitchen, added a master suite, created a home office that faced directly toward my parents' house. The symbolism was intentional. The discarded son building his success literally next door to the family that had rejected him. When the work was complete, I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of renting 1298, I moved in myself. After years of downtown apartments and corporate housing, I was coming home to Maple Street not as the defeated teenager who'd been thrown out, but as the successful adult who now owned a significant portion of the neighborhood. My first morning in the house, I stood at the kitchen window with my coffee, looking directly into the yard where I'd once played alone while Derek received all the attention. My mother was visible through her kitchen window, probably wondering about the new neighbor who'd moved in so close she could have borrowed a cup of sugar. If she'd looked carefully, she might have noticed something familiar about the silhouette. In the window, the height was right, the posture recognizable to someone who'd once known it well. But recognition would require acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would require confronting the possibility that the son they'd discarded had become the success they'd never imagined. That evening, I updated my map with the latest acquisition. 12 properties marked in green, 6 more identified as potential targets. The mathematical reality was becoming undeniable. Within another year or two, I would own most of Maple Street, including, if my research was correct, the house where it all began. The house where they'd decided I was dead weight. The house that was about to become just another property in my growing portfolio, with my parents as tenants rather than owners. The plan was working better than I'd dared hope. Soon, very soon, it would be time to remove the corporate veil and show them exactly who their new landlord was. ***. The past due mortgage notice was tucked behind my parents' storm door when I walked by on my morning run. A small white envelope that told a story I already knew but had never seen documented so starkly from my new vantage point at 1298 Maple Street. I had a front row seat to the slow-motion collapse of the family that had discarded me. Thompson's Hardware had closed permanently. 3 months earlier, 62 years of family business ending with a whimper rather than a bang. The final days had been painful to watch my father sitting alone in the empty store, going through papers and memories, occasionally breaking down in tears when he thought no one was looking. The failure wasn't sudden. I'd been tracking their business decline through public records and industry reports for years. The big box stores had eroded their customer base. Online retailers had captured their specialty sales, and their stubborn refusal to adapt had sealed their fate. They'd clung to outdated business models while pouring money into Derek's endless cycles of crisis and recovery. Derek himself was the most visible sign of their ongoing troubles. At 32, he was living in his childhood bedroom again, his latest attempt at sobriety having lasted all of 6 months. I'd see him sometimes, walking to the corner store for cigarettes or standing in the driveway, talking on his phone with the desperate gestures of someone trying to convince a skeptical audience. The conversations that drifted through our shared property line painted a picture of familiar chaos. Arguments about money, about responsibility, about consequences that never seemed to stick. My mother's voice, always strained when Derek was the subject. My father's, resigned to disappointment, but unable to stop enabling it. He's trying. I heard my mother say one evening, as I watered my garden, the counselor says relapse is part of recovery. How many parts of recovery can we afford? My father replied. The treatment center wants another $5,000 for extended care. From my kitchen window, I could see into their dining room, where papers were spread across the table in the universal pattern of financial crisis. Bills, statements, noticized the debris of a family drowning in obligations they couldn't meet. Irony was almost too perfect. While they struggled to keep their house, I was systematically acquiring every other house on the street. While they worried about Derek's next relapse, I was building wealth faster than I'd ever imagined possible. While they faced the consequences of 30 years of poor decisions, I was positioned to benefit from every one of those consequences. But watching their decline brought unexpected emotions. Satisfaction, yes, but also something that might have been pity. These were people who'd made terrible choices, but they were still human beings facing very real pain. Derek's addiction was destroying him regardless of family dynamics. My parents' business failure represented the end of their life's work. Whatever their failings as parents, the neighborhood gossip network kept me informed of details I couldn't observe directly. Mrs. Patterson mentioned that my mother had taken a part-time job at the grocery store, something that would have been unthinkable during their prosperous years. Mrs. Kim confided that my father had been asking neighbors about odd jobs: gutter cleaning, leaf removal, small repairs work he'd once been too proud to consider. Most telling detail came from Mr. Jameson, my old landscaping client, who still lived 2 streets over. He'd run into Derek at a gas station and described him as looking rough, talking about some big opportunity that was going to solve everything. I knew that pattern. Derek had been chasing big opportunities his entire adult life. Schemes, network marketing ventures, investment deals that always required just a little more money to pay off. Each one had drained more resources from my parents while delivering nothing but renewed disappointment. The past due mortgage notice confirmed what I'd suspected from my financial analysis of their situation. They were at least 3 months behind on payments, probably more. The house they'd owned for 25 years. The house they'd raised 2 sons in. The house where they'd decided one son was worth keeping and the other was house was slipping away from them. Standing in my own beautifully renovated kitchen, looking at their declining property through windows they didn't know belonged to their rejected son, I felt the weight of approaching vindication. Soon, very soon, they would lose the last symbol of their former stability, and when that happened, I would be ready with an offer they couldn't refuse. Not out of charity or sentimentality, but because owning their house would complete the circle. I'd been drawing around them for 3 years. The son they'd called dead weight was about to become their landlord. The boy they'd thrown away with a garbage bag of clothes was about to own the house where it all began. Justice, it turned out, had a very precise address. 1275 Maple Street. And I was already living next door. The detailed renovation plans for 1275 Maple Street were spread across my dining room table like architectural poetry. every line and measurement representing the transformation I envisioned for my childhood home. Not the vindictive destruction some might expect, but something far more powerful, the restoration of a house to its full potential, something my parents had never been able to achieve. I'd been preparing for this acquisition for months, having my architect develop comprehensive improvement plans based on the property's public records and my intimate knowledge of its layout. New kitchen with granite counters and stainless appliances, master bathroom expansion, hardwood floors throughout, a finished basement that could serve as additional living space, landscaping that would make it the crown jewel of Maple Street. The estimated cost was $180,000, more than the house was currently worth, but exactly what it would be worth when I finished. Unlike my parents, I understood the difference between spending money and investing it. My real estate attorney had been monitoring the foreclosure proceedings through public records. Thompson versus First National Bank was progressing exactly as expected. Missed payments, notices of default, legal filings that created a public timeline of financial collapse. The foreclosure auction was scheduled for 6 weeks out. Enough time to prepare my strategy, but not enough for my parents to find a miraculous solution. The beauty of my position was its flexibility. I could bid at the auction and acquire the property for probably 60 to 70% of its current market value, or I could approach my parents directly with a pre-foreclosure offer that would save their credit and give them enough money to relocate with dignity. Either way, I would own the house, but the direct approach would allow for a more satisfying revelation. Meanwhile, my presence on Maple Street was becoming impossible to ignore. I'd now completed renovations on 13 properties, each one raising the bar for neighborhood standards. The transformation was so dramatic that the city planning department had contacted me about serving as a case study for targeted neighborhood revitalization. The attention brought unexpected benefits. A local news station wanted to do a feature story about the Maple Street miracle, and a real estate magazine had requested an interview about my investment strategy. I declined both, preferring to maintain my anonymity until the moment was right for maximum impact. But the neighborhood buzz was reaching my parents whether I courted publicity or not. I'd see my mother standing at her window, looking at the improvements across the street with an expression I couldn't quite read. Envy, confusion, simple appreciation for better property values. Whatever she was thinking, she had to wonder who was behind the transformation happening all around her. My father's reactions were more direct. He'd started taking evening walks around the neighborhood, stopping to examine my renovations with the critical eye of someone who'd spent decades in the home improvement business. I watched him from my window one evening, studying the stonework I'd added to 1289's facade, clearly impressed despite himself. The irony was delicious. The man who'd dismissed me as dead weight was admiring workmanship I'd commissioned, improvements I'd designed, success I'd achieved. He was literally standing on property I owned, benefiting from investments I'd made, witnessing transformation I'd created. Derek's presence complicated the emotional landscape. His latest crisis involved a DUI arrest and license suspension, which meant he was essentially trapped in the neighborhood. I'd see him walking to the bus stop or riding a bicycle that looked too small for his adult frame. Sometimes he'd pause in front of my properties, staring at the improvements with what looked like resentment. Did he remember the quiet younger brother who'd once lived next door? Did he recognize anything familiar about the investment strategy that was transforming his childhood street? Or was he too focused on his own problems to notice the systematic success happening around him? The psychological positioning was almost perfect. I was simultaneously invisible and omnipresent, anonymous and influential, absent and completely in control. Every day brought new evidence of my success and their decline, but they remained oblivious to the connection. My morning runs took me past the hardware store that had been their life's work, now empty with 4 lease signs in the windows. The space looked smaller than I remembered, sadder somehow, like a suit that no longer fit its owner. I thought about the boy who'd loved that store, who'd had ideas for its future, who'd been dismissed as irrelevant to its legacy. That boy was gone, replaced by a man who'd built his own legacy without their help or belief. A man who'd proven that their biggest mistake wasn't failing to invest in Derek's athletic dreams, but failing to recognize the actual asset they'd possessed. The foreclosure timeline was accelerating, and my preparation was complete. Soon I would own the house where I'd learned that love was conditional, where I'd discovered that family loyalty had limits, where I'd been taught that my value was less than my brother's potential. But when I owned it, it would become something different entirely. Proof that the discarded son had become powerful enough to purchase his own childhood, successful enough to renovate his own memories, wealthy enough to control the narrative that had once controlled him. The plans on my table weren't just architectural drawings. They were blueprints for the most satisfying acquisition of my career. ***, the certified letter from Whitman. Ross and Associates arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a postal worker who had to wait while my father signed for it with shaking hands. I watched from my kitchen window as he tore open the envelope, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been relief. Inside was an offer to purchase 1275 Maple Street for $240,000 cash, with a closing date 30 days out. Enough money to pay off their mortgage, cover their debts, and give them a fresh start somewhere else. More importantly, enough to avoid the humiliation of foreclosure and the destruction of what remained of their credit. The offer came from Maple Holdings LLC, the same entity that had been quietly transforming their neighborhood for the past 3 years. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know from the legal documents, was that the LLC's sole owner was sitting 50 feet away, watching their reaction through windows they'd never imagined belonged to their discarded son. My attorney had crafted the letter perfectly. Professional but not cold, generous but not suspiciously so. The terms were straightforward: cash purchase, no inspections, quick closing, and the option for them to rent the property back at below rates if they wanted to remain in the neighborhood. We understand this may be a difficult decision during challenging times. The letter read, "Our goal is to provide a solution that benefits everyone involved while maintaining the positive trajectory. This neighborhood has experienced positive trajectory," as if their neighborhood's renaissance was some natural phenomenon rather than the result of systematic investment by the son they'd thrown away. Within an hour, my mother was on the phone with Mrs. Henderson, and within 2 hours, the entire neighborhood was buzzing with speculation about the mysterious offer. The gossip network that had once spread news of my supposed failures was now carrying stories of their potential salvation. "Maple Holdings is the same company that's been fixing up all the houses," Mrs. Henderson told anyone who would listen. "They've been good for the neighborhood. Maybe this is a blessing in disguise." A blessing in disguise. If only she knew how literal that phrase would prove to be. I gave them 3 days to process the offer before making my next move. 3 days to discuss their options, research the company, and convince themselves that this unexpected opportunity was exactly what they needed. 3 days to feel grateful to their anonymous benefactor. On Friday evening, I knocked on their front door. My mother answered, looking older than I remembered but still recognizable as the woman who'd once packed my lunch and helped with homework. Her hair was grayer, her face more lined, her expression carrying the weight of recent struggles. "Can I help you, Mrs. Thompson? I'm Marcus. I live next door." Recognition dawned slowly, like sunrise through fog. Her hand moved to her throat, her eyes widening as they processed features that had matured but remained fundamentally familiar. "Marcus, hello, Mom." The word hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we wanted to cross. Behind her, I could hear my father's voice asking who was at the door. She started, then stopped. "It's Marcus." My father appeared in the doorway, and for a moment we were all frozen in a tableau of impossible circumstances. The son they'd discarded standing on the porch of the house they were about to lose, looking successful and confident and nothing like the broken teenager they'd expected their rejection to create. "What are you doing here?" my father asked, his voice carefully neutral. "I wanted to talk to you about the offer you received. May I come in?" They exchanged glances, communicating in the wordless language of couples who'd been married for decades. Finally, my mother stepped aside. The house looked smaller than I remembered, shabbier around the edges. The furniture was the same, arranged in the same patterns, but everything seemed diminished somehow. Time and financial stress had worn away. The polish that memory had preserved. We sat in the living room where I'd once watched television and done homework, where Derek's trophies still lined the mantelpiece like monuments to faded glory. The silence stretched uncomfortably until my father broke it. "You look successful." "I've done well for myself." "What kind of work do you do? Real estate development? Commercial and residential properties?" My mother's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're not? You couldn't be. Maple Holdings LLC?" "Yes, that's my company." The revelation hit them like a physical blow. My father's face went pale. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. They stared at me as puzzle pieces clicked into place with almost audible precision. "You've been buying the houses on our street. 13 properties so far, including the one I live in next door." "You live next door," my mother whispered. "For 8 months now. I've been watching you struggle, watching Derek cycle through his problems, watching you face the consequences of choices you made years ago." My father found his voice. "Why are you here, Marcus? What do you want?" "I want to buy your house, but I wanted you to know who's making the offer." "This is about revenge," my mother said, tears starting to form. "You want to humiliate us?" "Actually, I want to help you. The offer stands $240,000 cash, enough to pay your debts and start over somewhere else. You can even stay as tenants if you prefer." "Why would you help us after?" My father's voice trailed off. "After you threw me out? After you called me dead? Wait, after you tried to steal my inheritance?" They both flinched at the accuracy of my summary. "I'm not the angry teenager you discarded," I continued. "I'm a successful adult who understands that holding grudges is expensive and forgiveness is profitable. You need money. I need this property. It's just business." But even as I said it, we all knew it was much more than business. It was justice served with surgical precision, success displayed with undeniable clarity. Proof that their greatest mistake was sitting in their living room offering to solve their greatest problem. The son they'd called dead weight was about to become their savior. Whether they could swallow that particular irony remained to be seen. ***, the original house key felt impossibly small in my palm as I set it on their coffee table. the brass worn smooth by decades of use. I'd carried it for 24 years, through college dorms and apartments and corporate housing, waiting for this moment when its symbolic weight would finally match its practical insignificance. You kept the key, my mother asked, her voice barely audible. I kept everything that mattered. This house. Your lessons about success and failure, your demonstration of what family loyalty actually means. My father leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. Marcus, you never meant what? To throw me out? To steal my college fund for Derek's legal problems? To apply for credit in my name? Which part was accidental? The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken truths. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked, and somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower started up. Normal sounds of suburban life, a soundtrack for an anything but normal conversation. We were desperate, my mother finally said. Derek was facing jail time. The lawyers said a lot of things, I'm sure. But desperation doesn't excuse what you did. It explains it, but it doesn't excuse it. My father's face flushed red. You don't understand what we were going through. Derek needed help. Derek needed consequences. He still needs consequences. But you've spent 30 years protecting him from them instead. He's sick, my mother protested. Addiction is a disease and enabling is a choice. One you made every day for decades. I looked around the room that had once been my entire world, seeing it now through the eyes of someone who'd built his own world without their help or approval, the worn carpet, the outdated furniture, the family photos that conspicuously excluded me from later years. All of it felt like artifacts from someone else's life. Where is Derek, by the way? I'd think he'd want to be here for this conversation. He's at a meeting, my mother said quickly. He's really trying this time. Good. For him, genuinely, recovery is hard work, and I hope he succeeds. My father studied my face, searching for sarcasm or malice. You mean that? I mean it. Derek's addiction isn't why I'm here. His addiction didn't make you choose him over me. It was just the excuse you used to justify choices you'd already made. The truth of that statement hung in the air like smoke. We all knew it was accurate, but none of us had ever said it out loud before. You were always so self-sufficient, my mother said, and I could hear her trying to rewrite history in real time. So independent. We thought you'd be fine on your own. Self-sufficient because you forced me to be. Independent because depending on you was clearly a mistake. I learned early that your love came with conditions I couldn't meet. That's not true, she said, but her voice lacked conviction, isn't it? Show me one time you chose me over Derek. One time you invested in my potential, instead of his problems. One time you treated us as equally valuable. The silence stretched long enough to become its own answer. My father cleared his throat. You've obviously done well for yourself. Better than we ever imagined. Better than you ever imagined because you never bothered to imagine it. You were so focused on Derek's unlikely football scholarship that you missed the actual scholar sitting at your dinner table. We made mistakes, my mother admitted, but we're still your parents. Biologically, yes. Functionally, I shrugged. That relationship ended when you handed me a garbage bag and changed the locks. The cruelty of my words surprised even me, but they felt necessary. Some truths required sharp edges to cut through decades of denial and rationalization. What do you want from us, Marcus? My father asked. An apology. Money. What would make this right? Nothing can make it right, but something can make it finished. I pulled out the purchase contract my attorney had prepared, setting it on the coffee table next to the key. This is a fair offer for your house. More than fair, actually. It pays off your mortgage, covers your debts, and gives you enough left over to start fresh somewhere else. Or you can stay as tenants at below market rent. Your choice. My mother picked up the contract with trembling hands. Why would you help us after everything? Because holding grudges is expensive. And I'm a businessman first. Because proving my success matters more than punishing your failures. Because I want to own this house, but I don't want to destroy you to get it. You could have just bought it at foreclosure, my father pointed out. I could have, but this way is cleaner. This way you get to tell people you sold to a successful investor, instead of admitting you lost everything. This way, your neighbors think you made a smart business decision, instead of a desperate one. I stood up, straightening my jacket. You have a week to decide. The offer expires next Friday at 5 p.m. Marcus, wait, my mother called as I reached the door. Do you hate us? I turned back to look at them, this middle-aged couple, sitting in their declining house, facing the consequences of decades of poor choices. They looked smaller than they had in my memories, more human and more fragile. I used to hate was easier than disappointment, and disappointment was easier than acceptance. But hate is a luxury I can't afford anymore. Then what do you feel? Pity and gratitude. Gratitude. You taught me that I couldn't depend on anyone but myself. You showed me that family loyalty is conditional and love has limits. You forced me to become strong enough to succeed without support or encouragement. In a twisted way, you gave me exactly what I needed to become who I am. I picked up the key from their coffee table and put it back in my pocket. Think about the offer. It's generous, and it won't last forever. I left them sitting in their living room, surrounded by the debris of their choices, holding a contract that would either save them or complete their humiliation. Either way, I would own the house where it all began. The boy they'd called deadweight was about to become their landlord. The son they'd thrown away was offering to buy their failures. Justice, it turned out, looked exactly like mercy, but it was justice nonetheless. The bank records spread across my dining room table told a story of systematic financial abuse that even I hadn't fully understood until now. Derek's addiction had been expensive, but the deeper crime was how my parents had funded it not just with their own money, but with mine, stolen before I'd even known it existed. I'd requested these documents through my attorney as part of due diligence for the house purchase, but what they revealed went far beyond simple financial mismanagement. The paper trail showed a 15-year pattern of theft, manipulation, and fraud that painted my parents as something worse than neglectful they were. Criminals who'd systematically stolen from their own son. The college fund they'd claimed never existed had been very real. Grandma Rose had established it when I was born, contributing faithfully every year until her death. By my 18th birthday, it contained nearly $75,000, enough to fund 4 years at any state university with money left over for graduate school. But 3 months before they threw me out, the account had been liquidated. The withdrawal form bore my father's signature as trustee, with educational expenses listed as the purpose. Except the money hadn't gone to education, it had gone to Derek's legal defense fund, rehabilitation costs, and the elaborate deception they'd constructed to hide his problems from the community. The theft went deeper. My social security number had been used to establish multiple credit accounts, each one maxed out and abandoned when payments became impossible. They'd stolen my identity to fund Derek's addiction, creating a shadow credit history that could have destroyed my financial future if I hadn't been monitoring it. But the most damning evidence was a series of insurance claims they'd filed over the years. My belongings, laptop, clothes, textbooks had been reported stolen in a burglary that conveniently occurred after they'd kicked me out. They'd collected nearly $8,000 in insurance money for property they'd simply given to Derek or thrown away. The documentation was ironclad, the evidence overwhelming. My parents weren't just terrible decision-makers, they were criminals who'd been stealing from me for years before finally discarding me entirely. Mrs. Patterson knocked on my door. While I was reviewing the bank statements, she was holding a casserole dish and wearing the expression of someone who'd heard gossip and wanted confirmation. "Marcus, honey, is it true you're buying your parents' house?" "It's true. And you've been living next door this whole time?" 8 months now." She set down the casserole and studied my face. "They don't know, do they, about what really happened when you left?" "What do you mean?" "I was friends with your grandmother, God rest her soul. She told me things about the college fund, about Derek's troubles. She was worried about you, worried about what they might do." My chest tightened. "What did she tell you?" "Everything. About the money she left you, about the fund they stole, about Derek's arrest that nobody was supposed to know about. She made me promise to look out for you if anything happened to her." Mrs. Patterson sat down heavily in my kitchen chair. "I tried to find you after you left, but your parents said you'd cut ties with the family, that you didn't want contact. I should have tried harder. It's not your fault. They were very convincing liars. The whole neighborhood believed their story, that you'd chosen to leave, that you were rebelling, that you'd turned your back on family. We all felt sorry for them. Having such an ungrateful son?" The irony burned. While I'd been building success and proving my worth, my parents had been playing victims to anyone who would listen, portraying themselves as the wounded parties in our family drama. Do people know the truth now? Some are starting to figure it out. Hard to ignore the timing, you appearing right when they're in trouble, owning half the neighborhood, obviously successful. Mrs. Henderson put it together first. "She always said you were too smart to just disappear." That evening, Derek showed up at my door. I'd been expecting this confrontation since revealing myself to our parents, but seeing him on my porch still felt surreal. He looked older than his 32 years, worn down by addiction and disappointment, but still recognizably the golden boy who'd once commanded all our parents' attention. "Can we talk?" I stepped aside to let him in. He looked around my renovated house with obvious amazement, taking in the hardwood floors, the custom kitchen, the artwork that spoke of both success and taste. "Nice place. Mom said you've done well for yourself." "I have. She also said you know about my problems." "I know about everything, Derek. The arrests, the addiction, the money they spent covering for you. I know about the college fund they stole to pay your legal bills." He flinched as if I'd hit him. "I didn't know about the college fund. Not until yesterday, but you knew something. You had to know they were spending money they didn't have." I was using. His voice was quiet, ashamed. "When you're using, you don't ask questions about where help comes from. You just take it, and try not to think about the cost. The cost was my education, my relationship with them, my place in this family. I know." He sat down heavily on my couch. "I'm sorry, Marcus. I'm sorry about all of it." The apology hung between us, sincere but insufficient. "Sorry doesn't undo 24 years of consequences. Are you clean now?" 6 months? Longest I've managed in years." "Good. Keep it up." He looked at me with something like wonder. You're really going to buy their house? I already own 13 others on this street. This just completes the collection. And you're offering to let them stay. Below market rent, month-to-month lease. More generous than they deserved. Derek was quiet for a long time, processing the magnitude of what I'd accomplished while he'd been destroying himself and our family. I ruined everything, didn't I? You made choices. They made choices. I made different choices. Do you hate me? I considered the question seriously. I used to, but hatred is exhausting, and I've had more important things to focus on. Like becoming rich enough to own our whole neighborhood. Like becoming successful enough that their opinion of me doesn't matter anymore. He nodded slowly. Mom's been crying since you left yesterday. Dad's been drinking. Not a lot, but more than usual. They're processing the consequences of decisions they made years ago. That's not my responsibility anymore. But you're still helping them. I'm making a business transaction that happens to solve their problem. There's a difference. Derek stood up, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I remembered from childhood. For what it's worth, I always knew you were smarter than me, even when everyone was pretending otherwise. Intelligence isn't the issue. Choices are, yet I made terrible ones. After he left, I sat in my beautiful house, surrounded by evidence of success I'd built without their help or approval. The bank records told one story, systematic theft and betrayal spanning decades. But Derek's visit told another, the human cost of addiction, and enabling that had destroyed our family from the inside out. Tomorrow, the neighborhood would know the whole truth. The mysterious investor who'd been transforming Maple Street was the discarded son who'd become more successful than anyone had imagined possible. The family they'd pitied for having an ungrateful child was actually a crime family that had stolen from their victim. But tonight, I simply felt tired. Vindication was satisfying, but it was also exhausting. Proving them wrong had taken everything I had for 24 years. Now that I'd done it, I wasn't sure what came next. Perhaps that was tomorrow's question to answer. The new lease agreement I drafted for my parents was a masterpiece of fair-minded justice. Every clause designed to protect both parties, while establishing clear boundaries that had never existed in our family relationship. The terms were generous $1,200 per month for a house that could easily rent for $2,000, but the conditions were non-negotiable. No subletting without written permission, which meant Derek couldn't move friends or dealers into the house. No modifications to the property without approval, which meant no holes punched in walls during family arguments. Rent due on the first of every month, no exceptions, no family discounts for late payments. Most importantly, a clause that allowed me to terminate the lease with 30 days' notice if the terms were violated. You're treating us like strangers, my mother said when I presented the lease for their review. We were sitting in what would soon be my kitchen, the same space where she'd once made my school lunches and helped with homework. I'm treating you like tenants, which is what you'll be. Our family relationship ended 24 years ago. This is a business arrangement. My father studied the document with the careful attention of someone who'd learned not to trust fine print. These terms are actually quite reasonable. More generous than I expected. They're fair. I'm not trying to punish you, I am trying to protect myself and my investment. Derek had been living elsewhere since our conversation, staying with friends, while attending daily AA meetings and working a part-time job at a local warehouse. The change seemed genuine this time, though I'd learned not to invest too much hope in his periodic attempts at sobriety. Will Derek be allowed to visit? My mother asked. Of course, but he can't live here, and he can't use this address for mail or official purposes. If he relapses and brings drama to my property, you'll be evicted. Not because I hate him, but because I won't enable his addiction the way you have. The boundary felt harsh but necessary. 24 years of watching them destroy themselves trying to save Derek had taught me that enabling addiction helps nobody, not the addict, not the family, not the community that has to deal with the consequences. What if he gets clean permanently? My father asked. Then we'll revisit the situation in a year. But recovery has to be proven, not promised. 3 days later, they signed the lease. The closing on the house had gone smoothly, with my parents walking away with enough money to pay their debts and start over if they chose to. Instead, they'd decided to stay as my tenants, trading ownership for stability in the only neighborhood they'd ever really known. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. The son they'd called deadweight was now their landlord. The boy they'd thrown out was now responsible for keeping a roof over their heads. The family member they'd rejected was now the one ensuring their financial security. But the arrangement worked because it was honest. No pretense of happy family reunions, no attempt to rebuild relationships that had been poisoned decades earlier. Just a straightforward business transaction between people who happened to share DNA and history. The neighborhood reaction was mixed but mostly positive. Mrs. Henderson called me a saint for helping my parents despite their past treatment. Mr. Jameson said it showed remarkable character to respond to betrayal with generosity. Mrs. Kim simply nodded approvingly, as if she'd always known things would work out this way. A few neighbors seemed uncomfortable with the family drama playing out on their street, but most appreciated that I'd prevented a foreclosure that would have hurt everyone's property values. The Maple Street Renaissance continued, and my parents' financial crisis had been resolved without dragging down the neighborhood. Derek's response surprised me most. He called 2 weeks after they'd signed the lease, asking if we could meet for coffee. "I want to thank you," he said when we sat down at a cafe near his new apartment. "Not just for helping them, but for setting boundaries I could never set myself." "What do you mean?" "I've been using them as a safety net my entire adult life, knowing I could always go home, always get help, always be rescued from my own mistakes. It enabled my addiction as much as any drug." I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or self-deception. But he seemed genuinely different this time, clearer, more grounded, more honest about his own role in our family's dysfunction. "The lease terms force me to stay clean," he continued, "not for promises or guilt trips or family expectations, but because there are real consequences. Now, if I screw up, they lose their home. That's motivation I've never had before. It's not your responsibility to keep them housed, it's your responsibility to stay clean for yourself. I know, but having external consequences helps. For the first time in my life, my choices affect people I care about in ways I can't undo or manipulate away." 6 months into the lease arrangement, the new dynamic seemed to be working. My parents paid rent on time, maintained the property well, and treated me with the careful politeness of tenants who knew their landlord's patience had limits. Derek visited occasionally, but never stayed overnight, and his recovery seemed more stable than previous attempts. I had achieved something I'd never expected: justice without cruelty, success without revenge, boundaries without hatred. The family that had rejected me was now dependent on my generosity, but that dependence was structured in a way that protected everyone involved. Most surprisingly, I was beginning to enjoy owning the house where I'd grown up, not because of nostalgia or sentimentality, but because I'd transformed it from a source of pain into a symbol of success. The boy who'd been thrown out with a garbage bag now owned the deed. The son who'd been called dead weight now controlled the mortgage. It was, I realized, exactly the kind of poetic justice that Grandma Rose would have appreciated. She'd planted the seeds of my independence with her inheritance, and now those seeds had grown into a tree large enough to provide shade, even for those who'd tried to cut it down. The lease agreement hanging in my home office represented more than a rental contract. It was a declaration of independence, a statement of boundaries, and proof that success was the best revenge only when it was generous enough to include mercy. ***. The Neighborhood Improvement Association charter that 17 households signed on a warm September evening represented something I'd never intended to create, but was proud to see emerge: a community united around shared values rather than shared resentments. The meeting was held in my backyard, under string lights I'd installed between oak trees that had watched this street evolve for 50 years. "Marcus has shown us what's possible when someone invests in our neighborhood," Mrs. Henderson said, addressing the gathered residents. "Property values are up 23% in 3 years. Crime is down, and we have a waiting list of families who want to move here." The transformation had indeed been remarkable. What started as one man's strategic revenge had evolved into something larger and more meaningful, a model for how communities could heal and thrive. When someone was willing to lead by example, rather than just complaining about problems, the association's mission was simple: maintain and improve the quality of life on Maple Street through coordinated property maintenance, neighborhood events, and advocacy with city services. But the deeper purpose was building the kind of community connections that had been fraying for decades. "I nominate Marcus as our first president," said Mr. Jameson, the elderly man whose backyard bird sanctuary had sparked my love for creating beauty from neglect. "I appreciate the confidence," I replied, "but I think this should be led by someone who's been here longer, someone with deeper roots in this community." Mrs. Patterson raised her hand. "Marcus, with all due respect, you've earned the right to lead. You've invested more in this neighborhood than anyone else, and your vision has guided our improvement." The vote was unanimous. Despite my protests, at 42 years old, I was president of the neighborhood association for the street where I'd once been considered disposable. The irony was almost too perfect to be real. The first challenge came sooner than expected. A developer approached several elderly residents about selling their homes for a strip mall project. The offers were generous but would destroy the residential character we'd worked so hard to build. "They're targeting Mrs. Chen and the Johnsons," Mrs. Henderson reported at our emergency meeting. "Both families are on fixed incomes, and the developer is offering twice what their houses are worth." I already owned enough of the street to block any major development. But this wasn't about my property rights, it was about protecting neighbors who'd become something like family over the past 3 years. "I'll match the developer's offer for any resident who wants to sell," I announced. "But I'll only buy with the understanding that I'll sell back to approved families at fair market value." The room went quiet. Even by my standards, offering to purchase additional properties just to preserve neighborhood character was extraordinary. "Marcus, that could be millions of dollars," Mrs. Patterson said. "It's an investment in our community. These houses are worth more as part of a stable neighborhood than as teardowns for commercial development." The developer withdrew his offers when he realized he'd be competing against someone with deeper pockets and stronger community ties. Mrs. Chen and the Johnsons decided to stay, and the threat passed without anyone being displaced. But the episode taught me something unexpected about leadership and community responsibility. Owning most of the street had given me power, but using that power to protect rather than exploit had given me something more valuable: genuine respect and affection for my neighbors. The annual block party that October was the largest in Maple Street's history. Families from surrounding blocks asked to join, drawn by stories of our community spirit and property improvements. Local news stations covered the event, framing it as an example of grassroots neighborhood revitalization. My parents attended, moving through the crowd with the careful politeness of people who understood their status had fundamentally changed. They were no longer the established residents welcoming newcomers, they were tenants, whose landlord had become the community's most respected leader. Derek surprised everyone by showing up with his sponsor from a grizzled construction worker named Pete who'd been clean for 15 years. "Your brother's been talking about this neighborhood," Pete told me. "Says it's the first place he's lived where success is celebrated instead of resented. It's taken some work to build that culture. Most places never figure it out. You've got something special here." The highlight of the evening was unveiling the community garden we'd created in a vacant lot I'd purchased and donated to the association: raised beds filled with vegetables and flowers, a greenhouse for year-round growing, and benches where neighbors could gather and children could learn about growing things. Mrs. Kim had designed the layout. Drawing on memories of her grandmother's garden in Korea, Mr. Jameson contributed his expertise with native plants that would attract birds and butterflies. Even my mother had volunteered to help with the herb garden, her first meaningful contribution to community life in years. Standing in that garden as the sun set over Maple Street, surrounded by neighbors who'd become friends and family members, who'd become tenants, I felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood, a sense of belonging that wasn't conditional on performance or achievement. The boy who'd been thrown away had created a place where everyone was welcome, where success was shared rather than hoarded, where community was built through contribution rather than competition. The neighborhood that had once rejected me now looked to me for leadership and protection. But the most satisfying moment came when Mrs. Henderson pulled me aside near the end of the evening. "Your grandmother would be so proud," she said, squeezing my hand. "She always said you had the biggest heart of anyone in your family." Turns out she was right about everything. Rose's investment in my future had yielded returns none of us could have calculated. Her $150,000 inheritance had grown into millions in real estate equity. But more importantly, her belief in my potential had grown into a community transformation that would outlast any of us. The charter hanging in my home office represented more than neighborhood organization. It was proof that the discarded son had become the community builder, that the rejected family member had created a family large enough to include everyone, even those who'd once rejected him. Healing, it turned out, worked best when it was shared rather than hoarded, when success lifted everyone rather than just settling scores. The thank you card from the Martinez family arrived on a Tuesday morning, hand-delivered by their 8-year-old daughter, Sophia, who lived in the house where Mrs. Kowalski had once baked cookies for neighborhood children. The card was construction paper and crayon, with a drawing of our street showing every house in bright colors and stick figures playing in the community garden. "Thank you for making our neighborhood beautiful," Sophia had written in careful second-grade cursive. "My mom says you're a hero." Hero, the word followed me through the day as I reviewed financial reports that showed my Maple Street investments had appreciated 340% over 5 years. Hero, while I negotiated the purchase of 3 more properties in adjacent neighborhoods, expanding my community development model beyond the street where it all began. Hero, as I prepared for a city council meeting where they'd asked me to serve on the Affordable Housing Committee. A hero. If only Sophia knew that her hero had started as someone else's villain, that the man who'd created beauty and stability on Maple Street had once been considered deadweight by the people who should have loved him most. But perhaps that was exactly why the description fit. Heroes aren't people who never fall down. They're people who get back up and then help others do the same. The city council meeting that evening was standing room only, packed with residents from 4 neighborhoods who'd heard about the Maple Street model and wanted to replicate it in their own communities. My presentation was simple: strategic property acquisition, systematic improvements, community engagement, and long-term thinking could transform declining areas into thriving neighborhoods. The key, I told the assembled crowd, isn't just buying properties and fixing them up. It's building relationships, creating opportunities for residents to invest in their own community, and proving that success works better when it's shared. Councilwoman Rodriguez raised her hand. "Mr. Thompson, this approach requires significant capital investment up front. How do you recommend communities without wealthy investors achieve similar results?" "Start smaller, focus on one block, build relationships with existing residents, and create partnerships between private investors and community organizations. Success breeds success. Prove the model works on a small scale, and larger investment will follow." After the meeting, a young woman approached me with a familiar story. Recent college graduate, family financial problems, dreams bigger than her current circumstances suggested were realistic. "I grew up in Riverside Park," she said. "It's rough now, but it has good bones. My grandmother owned a house there for 40 years before she lost it to foreclosure. I want to buy it back someday and fix up the whole block." Her name was Angela Martinez, Sophia's older sister. I realized her story echoed mine in ways that made my chest tight with recognition. The determined set of her jaw, the carefully controlled emotion when she talked about her family's losses, the vision of transformation that seemed impossible but felt necessary. "Tell me about your plans," I said. We talked for an hour in the parking lot outside City Hall. Angela had a degree in urban planning, experience in nonprofit management, and a 5-year strategy for community revitalization that showed impressive understanding of both finance and human nature. What she lacked was capital and connections. "I'd like to offer you a partnership," I said as our conversation wound down. "I'll provide initial funding and mentorship. You provide local knowledge and community relationships. We'll start with your grandmother's house and see what we can build from there." The look on her face reminded me of my own expression when I'd first read Grandma Rose's letter about the life insurance policy. Surprise, hope, and the dawning realization that someone believed in her potential enough to invest in it. 3 months later, I stood in the backyard of Angela's grandmother's house, now renovated and serving as the community center for her neighborhood improvement project, watching her lead a meeting about crime prevention and property maintenance. She had the same natural leadership ability I'd discovered in myself, the same instinct for building consensus and inspiring action. "You've created something special here," I told her after the meeting. "We've created something special. Your investment made it possible, but the community made it real." That evening, I walked through the neighborhoods I'd helped transform over the past 5 years. Maple Street was just the beginning. Now I owned properties in 6 different areas, each one anchoring a community development project that balanced profit with purpose. The financial returns had been extraordinary. My real estate portfolio was worth over $12 million, generating enough passive income to fund expansion into new markets, while supporting the affordable housing initiatives that had become my passion. But the personal returns had been even more valuable. I'd built the family I'd never had through community connections that ran deeper than blood. Mrs. Henderson brought me soup when I was sick. Mr. Jameson still called for advice about his bird garden. Mrs. Kim insisted on doing my laundry because successful young men need someone to take care of them. Derek had been clean for 18 months and was enrolled in a community college program for addiction counseling. Even my parents had found a kind of peace in their new circumstances. My father helped other elderly residents with home maintenance, sharing skills he'd developed during 40 years in the hardware business. My mother volunteered at the community garden and had become something of an expert on companion planting. They paid their rent on time, maintained their property well, and treated me with respectful gratitude that felt more genuine than the conditional love of my childhood. The thank you card from Sophia Martinez was pinned to my office wall next to Grandma Rose's letter, 2 pieces of paper that bookended a journey from rejection to redemption. Between them hung the business license for my first landscaping company, the magna cum laude diploma, the promotion letter from Harrison and Associates, and the Neighborhood Association charter, artifacts of a life rebuilt from nothing, proof that being discarded by one family had freed me to create something larger and more meaningful than I could have imagined at 18. That night, I called my old academic advisor, Dr. Martinez. "Marcus, I saw the article in the Business Journal about your affordable housing initiative. Impressive work, thank you. Actually, I'm calling about that teaching opportunity you mentioned years ago. I think I'm ready to share what I've learned. Guest lectures or full-time faculty? Let's start with guest lectures and see where it leads. I have stories to tell about turning adversity into opportunity, about building success that lifts communities instead of just individuals." As I hung up the phone, I realized that the boy who'd been called dead weight had become a man whose weight was measured by the communities he'd lifted, the families he'd housed, the young people he'd mentored toward their own versions of success. The son who'd been thrown away had learned to build homes for others. The family member who'd been rejected had created neighborhoods where everyone belonged. The 18-year-old with a garbage bag of clothes had become a 40-year-old with a portfolio of properties and a legacy of community transformation. But most importantly, the angry teenager who'd promised to prove his parents wrong had evolved into a man who understood that the best revenge was building something so beautiful, so meaningful, so lasting that everyone who saw it, including those who'd once rejected him, would understand exactly what they'd thrown away, and exactly what their discarded son had become when they'd finally set him free to discover his own worth.